They chose my sister over me, but karma came in the form of my grandparents. I still remember the day as if it happened yesterday. It was a warm, late summer afternoon, and sunlight poured through our living room windows, illuminating every dust mote in the air. My mother was preparing dinner in the kitchen, banging pots and pans with more force than necessary. Dad, in his usual after-work routine, sat on the couch flipping through channels and muttering about the traffic he'd endured on his commute. Meanwhile, my sister, Adriana, had taken over the dining table. Her books and notes spread out like she was planning some grand takeover rather than simply studying for her midterm. I walked in from my part-time job, exhausted but still buoyed by a small sense of accomplishment because my manager had just praised me for my hard work. It was a bright spot in what was otherwise a pretty mundane week. I couldn't wait to tell my parents, to let them know that for once, I felt recognized and valued somewhere. That was the moment I realized, with a sting that felt almost physical, just how deeply the lines in our household had been drawn. Without so much as a glance up from the couch, my dad asked how Adriana's exam prep was going. "She's been studying for hours," he said. "We want her to get the highest score in her class." My mother chimed in from the kitchen, her voice elevated over the pots clanging, adding, "She's got that scholarship interview coming up too, so I want you all to keep it down in the house. No distractions." For a split second, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, they would also ask about my day, or at the very least, my well-being. But the moment passed. They didn't seem to notice me standing there, let alone the tiny, self-congratulatory smile I wore. I had been excited to share that my boss thought I was a quick learner, that I might even get promoted soon. But in the face of their hyper-focus on my sister, that news suddenly felt insignificant. It was like watching a balloon deflate in slow motion. As quietly as I could, I slipped out of the living room and headed to my bedroom, the one oasis of calm I had in this house. Behind the closed door, I let myself feel the weight of disappointment. Adriana was 2 years younger than me, yet somehow, she'd managed to command our parents' undivided attention from the moment she was born. I used to chalk it up to her having a certain sparkle. She was extroverted, energetic, and relentlessly ambitious. But as time went on, I realized that no matter what I did or said, my parents always seemed to funnel their energy toward her achievements, leaving me in the role of a side character in my own home. It wasn't that they disliked me. It was that they seldom seemed to notice me at all. Where Adriana got praise and resources, private tutors, extracurricular activities, constant pep talks, I got passive comments about being easygoing and independent, as if that excused their lack of investment in my life. It's strange how being labeled independent can sometimes feel like a backhanded compliment, especially when it comes from your own parents. Essentially, they were telling me I was self-sufficient enough not to need their support, so they could pour all their energy into my sister. That evening, after hearing a muffled round of cheers in the living room, apparently Adriana had aced a practice test, I decided I needed some air. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the front door without announcing my departure. The walk to my grandparents' house wasn't long, just a few blocks through our quiet suburban neighborhood. By the time I reached their front porch, my heart felt a little lighter. My grandparents' small, cozy home had always felt like a second refuge. They were known in the community for their warmth and generosity. Neighbors often stopped by just to chat or borrow a cup of sugar. But as I rang the doorbell, I didn't know the conversation that awaited me inside would be the first sign of a massive shift in my life. My grandmother opened the door with her usual radiant smile. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes sparkled with the same kindness I'd known since I was a child. "There you are," she exclaimed, giving me a tight hug. My grandfather, a tall man with a gentle voice, waved at me from his armchair. "About time," he teased, flipping the TV volume down. "We were wondering when you'd pop in." I hadn't meant to unload all my frustrations so suddenly, but within minutes, it all came pouring out. How invisible I felt at home, how Adriana was practically the sun in my parents' universe, and how lonely it was to be standing in the shadows. My grandmother listened, her brow creasing in concern. My grandfather nodded thoughtfully, occasionally asking a clarifying question but mostly letting me speak. By the time I finished, tears were threatening to spill over, and I felt both embarrassed and relieved. Life has a funny way of rewarding sincerity and kindness, my grandmother said, patting my hand. Sometimes, the people who seem to be the center of everything aren't always on the best path. But you, my dear, your time will come. My grandfather followed up with, and when it does, your parents will see what they've been missing. I have no doubt about that. At the time, I dismissed those words as gentle reassurances, the kind grandparents offer to quell your worries. But there was a quiet conviction in their voices that planted a seed of hope in me. Before I left that night, my grandparents asked me to drop by again soon. There was something in their eyes, a subtle but significant exchange between the two of them, that made me think they were planning something. It wasn't until much later that I would come to understand the full extent of their intentions. For the moment, though, I left their house feeling marginally better. Walking home, the evening sky turned a soft shade of lavender, stars just beginning to emerge. I inhaled the cool air, wishing life could remain that peaceful. But as soon as I re-entered our house, the tension returned like a suffocating blanket. Adriana was in the living room with our parents, excitedly discussing her upcoming scholarship interview. I tried to slip by unnoticed, though part of me wanted them to at least acknowledge my presence. My father spared a quick glance at me, and then went right back to doting on Adriana's achievements. In that moment, a quiet determination ignited inside me. I realized that if I wanted to carve out my own space in this family, or in this world, I'd have to make it happen on my own. My parents had chosen my sister, time and again, but I refused to let that choice define me or diminish what I could accomplish. Little did I know, though, that karma was already setting the stage. My grandparents, with their tender smiles and hidden resolve, would become more crucial to my future than I ever could have predicted. It was the first step in a journey that would test my patience, challenge my identity, and ultimately reveal just how powerful and life-changing real family support could be. Things escalated in the weeks following my visit to my grandparents' house. At first, it was nothing dramatic, just a sense that something in the air was shifting. My father grew more intense about Adriana's future, often grilling her on her study habits right at the dinner table. My mother seemed to be on a perpetual quest to perfect Adriana's already impressive resume, suggesting new clubs, volunteer positions, and weekend workshops she should attend. If I happened to be in the same room, they'd flash me a polite nod or a single question. How was work? But never stuck around to hear the answer. It became a daily reminder that my sister's success was their top priority, and I was an afterthought at best. For her part, Adriana didn't complain about the attention. If anything, she soaked it up like a flower in sunlight, growing more assured with each compliment tossed her way. I couldn't blame her for thriving under their praise. We're all wired to respond positively to acknowledgement. And yet, a nagging voice inside me kept asking, but what about me? That voice grew louder each time my parents overlooked some milestone in my life. A good day at work, a small promotion, or even the fact that I was trying to save money for community college classes. Every success or step forward I managed to achieve felt overshadowed by Adriana's perpetual spotlight. At night, when the house was finally quiet, I found solace in journaling. I'd light a small lavender-scented candle, prop a pillow against my headboard, and jot down every thought I couldn't say aloud. Pages filled with descriptions of my day, my frustrations, and hopes I didn't quite dare to speak. Sometimes I'd think back to what my grandparents had told me, how life's fairness has a way of surfacing eventually. I wasn't sure I fully believed it yet, but writing down their words gave me a flicker of reassurance. One evening, I had just finished a shift at the bookstore, a job that, while not glamorous, felt like a safe haven. I loved being surrounded by stories, the quiet hum of people browsing, and the camaraderie I'd built with my coworkers. Tired but content, I walked into the house to find Adriana holding court in the living room, my parents on either side of her. She was talking about some upcoming science fair that, if she won, could springboard her into a prestigious summer program. My mother was practically glowing. My father was already talking about how we might rearrange finances to cover any associated costs, private tutoring, new equipment, anything she might need to be the best. I stood there in the hallway, watching them discuss all this with an electric excitement, and felt my stomach churn with envy. They had never once asked about my own academic goals. In fact, They barely acknowledged that I was even considering returning to school part-time. My mother spotted me hovering near the door and gave a little wave. "Honey," she called, in that distant tone she used when she needed a favor, "could you pick up some supplies for Adriana tomorrow? She needs a few art boards and special markers for her display." Her words stung. She didn't even bother asking if I was busy or if I had plans after work. It was a given that my schedule, my life, revolved around assisting Adriana in hers. For a moment, I felt the urge to refuse, but old habits die hard, and the path of least resistance seemed simpler. I just nodded, mumbling "sure," before heading to the kitchen. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, at least not in that moment. Later that week, I visited my grandparents again. Something about their home always put me at ease. My grandfather was in the backyard, carefully tending to a small vegetable garden, while my grandmother sat on a nearby bench peeling apples for a pie. I joined them, rolling up my sleeves to help. The calm of their yard, chirping birds, the soft breeze rustling leaves, felt like an oasis compared to the tense atmosphere back at home. My grandmother asked how I was doing, and for a moment, I considered glossing everything over. But I decided against it. I told them about feeling invisible, about the constant push for Adriana's accomplishments, and how I felt overshadowed by them. My grandmother's eyes flickered with sympathy, and my grandfather paused his gardening to listen more intently. Grandpa cleared his throat. "I know it's hard to accept, but your parents might be too wrapped up in the idea of Adriana's potential to see what's right in front of them. Another child, working hard, building her own life. It's their loss if they can't see it." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I don't want to resent my sister," I admitted. "But sometimes I can't help it. She barely acknowledges how good she has it, and I'm left scrambling for whatever crumbs of attention are left over." My grandmother put down the apple she was peeling. "Resentment is a heavy burden. Even so, you're entitled to your feelings, dear. Just remember that it won't always be this way." She didn't elaborate, but I sensed there was a determined edge to her voice. That evening, as we parted ways, my grandfather pressed a small envelope into my hand. It was sealed, with nothing written on the outside. He just winked and said, "Save this for when you feel like you need a push. We believe in you." Curiosity gnawed at me as I walked home, the envelope tucked securely in my jacket pocket. But a weird sense of respect, or maybe fear of disappointment, kept me from opening it right away. Back at the house, I found my parents poring over a lengthy document that looked suspiciously like the application for Adriana's summer program. They barely noticed me as I walked past them to my room. Inside, I locked the door and pulled out the envelope. My heart hammered as I carefully slid my finger under the seal, revealing a single folded piece of paper. Written in my grandfather's neat, looping penmanship was a sentence that hit me like a jolt of electricity. "When the time comes, remember, you have everything you need and will always stand behind you." A warmth spread through my chest as I reread those words. It wasn't a grand gift of money or some fancy present. It was a simple affirmation. Yet, it felt more real than any forced compliment I'd ever gotten from my parents. It was a promise, plain and powerful, that I wasn't alone in my corner of the world. I carefully folded the note and tucked it into my bedside drawer. Like a secret talisman, I could turn to whenever I felt lost in the shadows of my sister's spotlight. Over the next few days, I kept that note in my mind, replaying my grandfather's words and that quiet certainty in my grandmother's eyes. Slowly, I noticed a shift in my own attitude. At work, I volunteered for new tasks, trying to push my limits and see what I could achieve if I just believed in myself a little more. I talked to a coworker who was also juggling part-time classes, gleaning advice about scheduling and financial aid. Each small step felt like I was carving out my own path, tiny but tangible steps toward a future that didn't hinge on my parents' approval. Of course, my family dynamic at home remained unchanged. My dad still peppered Adriana with questions about her scholarship applications, while my mom hovered over her like a stage manager, choreographing each aspect of her academic show. But I found myself caring a bit less about their oblivion. Yes, it still hurt when they brushed off my achievements, but with the note from Grandpa in my possession, I felt as though I had a silent ally in the house, even if that ally lived a few blocks away. One afternoon, the tension in the house hit a boiling point. Adriana had come home triumphant about winning a local competition, and my parents acted like she'd just been elected president. Balloons were purchased. A celebratory dinner was planned. But as I walked through the door, laden with grocery bags, it was like walking into a party where I was only invited to serve drinks. My parents didn't even acknowledge me, lost in their excitement. Adriana, for her part, gave me a cursory glance before shrugging as if to say, "What do you want me to do about it?" In that moment, an unexpected sense of resolve washed over me. I realized I didn't need them to celebrate me, at least not right now. I had my grandparents, who believed in me wholeheartedly. I had a job where I was learning new skills and receiving genuine praise. And I had plans, small as they were, to advance my education on my own terms. Maybe one day my parents would see that I was worth their attention, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for it. Over the next few weeks, I focused on my own path. I saved every extra dollar from work, started researching community college programs in earnest, and even confided in a close friend about my plans. Whenever doubt crept in, I read that single line in my grandfather's note, reminding myself that I had someone in my corner. I had a feeling, deep in my bones, that a reckoning was coming, one that might expose just how lopsided my parents' favoritism truly was. For now, though, I held on to the quiet knowledge that I was not alone, and that perhaps karma, or simply life's inevitability, was lining things up in ways none of us could yet foresee. As summer stretched on, I settled into a strange rhythm at home. Adriana was busy with her science fair projects, scholarship interviews, and whatever other accolade my parents encouraged her to chase next. I, on the other hand, quietly refined my own plans, working shifts at the bookstore, setting aside funds for community college, and focusing on small victories that went largely unnoticed within our own four walls. Although the favoritism stung, I found myself gradually less wounded by it. It was as if I'd grown a thicker skin, fortified by my grandparents' unwavering support. One Saturday afternoon, I was perched on my bed, laptop open, researching class schedules for the upcoming semester. The house was unusually quiet. Adriana and my parents had gone on a day trip to visit a nearby campus that was courting my sister with promises of scholarships and honors programs. With the entire place to myself, I let out a contented sigh and turned up the volume on my favorite playlist. The sun filtered through my curtains, casting warm patches of light on the floor. For once, there were no urgent requests to help Adriana with this, or pick up that for Adriana. It felt luxurious, having nobody to cater to but myself. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced over at the screen, expecting a message from a coworker or one of my few close friends. Instead, I saw a text from Grandma. "We're having a little get-together tomorrow. Can you come by in the afternoon? Grandpa and I have some exciting news." A small rush of curiosity fluttered through me. It wasn't unusual for my grandparents to host family gatherings, but the phrase "exciting news" sparked my imagination. Maybe they were planning a trip or celebrating an anniversary I'd forgotten about. Without hesitation, I texted back that I'd be there. The next day dawned bright and sweltering, typical of late summer. I hopped into my car around noon and made the short drive to my grandparents' place, noticing an unfamiliar car parked out front when I arrived. As I walked up the porch steps, I spotted my Aunt Caroline, a cousin of my mother's, emerging from the house with a broad grin. She nodded politely to me before slipping into her vehicle, leaving a faint air of mystery in her wake. Inside, I found my grandparents bustling around the kitchen, slicing fruit and arranging a platter of cookies. Grandpa flashed me a conspiratorial smile. "I'm glad you're here," he said, pulling me into a gentle hug. Grandma, busy washing strawberries in the sink, waved me over. "We're expecting a few more people," she explained, a twinkle in her eye. "The more, the merrier." I barely had time to puzzle over who else might be coming before the doorbell rang again. Throughout the next hour, a steady trickle of relatives appeared, some I hadn't seen in years. A pair of second cousins, my grandmother's old neighbor, even an old friend of Grandpa's from his carpentry days. They all converged in the living room, making friendly small talk and sipping lemonade. The energy in the house felt electric, yet nobody seemed to know exactly what the occasion was. A few folks whispered speculation. Maybe Grandma and Grandpa were finally selling the house. Maybe they were renewing vows. My mind ran wild with possibilities. Eventually, Grandma cleared her throat. "If everyone could gather in the living room, we'd like to share something," she announced. My stomach fluttered. I stole a glance at Grandpa, who offered me a quick wink before following her. We congregated around the sofa, some of us perched on chairs or the floor as Grandma and Grandpa stood side by side. Grandpa began, his deep voice carrying a hint of pride. "We appreciate everyone coming by today. Some of you traveled quite a distance. We promise not to keep you in suspense for too long." He paused, giving Grandma a soft look. "We've spent years working hard, saving, planning. And while there's nothing we love more than this old house, we think it's time to put our savings towards something meaningful, education for our grandchildren." A hush fell over the group. My heart thumped loudly. Education for our grandchildren. I wondered if they'd finally cave to the pressure of helping Adriana pay for her fancy college. But as if she'd read my thoughts, Grandma shot me a pointed glance, a faint smile on her lips. "Now, we know many of you have children of your own, and we wish we could help everyone. But this is something special we've dreamed up for our grandchildren who have been quietly forging their own path." Grandpa nodded in my direction. "We've always believed in supporting those who show determination and heart, even when the world doesn't always recognize them." His eyes seemed to glisten. "That's why we decided to set aside a fund, small, but enough to take some of the burden off, for someone who's trying to build a future one step at a time." My breath caught in my throat. I felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness, aware that all eyes were turning toward me. A second later, a ripple of realization moved through the room, like a collective exhale. Slowly, it hit me. My grandparents were talking about me. They weren't crafting some scholarship exclusively for Adriana. They weren't awarding money to the most academically lauded child in the family. They were giving something to me, the quiet, overlooked granddaughter who'd been saving up tips and small paychecks, hopping to take college courses at her own pace. Emotion welled up in my chest, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Even though the living room was filled with relatives, I felt like it was only me and my grandparents sharing that moment. My grandmother extended a gentle hand toward me. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with affection. Cautiously, I rose from my spot and stood beside them. My cheeks burned, not with embarrassment, but with the unfamiliar glow of recognition. "That's right," Grandpa said, addressing the crowd but fixing his warm gaze on me. "It might not be a fortune, but we hope it'll give you some breathing room. Take those classes you've been eyeing. Follow the path you want, not the one everyone else thinks you should follow." For a second, I couldn't speak. A lump formed in my throat, tears gathering in my eyes. I managed to stammer out something. "Thank you so much," but it felt inadequate. How do you properly thank two people who have believed in you when so few others have? My grandparents wrapped me in a hug, and the room erupted in gentle applause. A few relatives dabbed at their eyes, while others whispered supportive comments. In the aftermath, people congratulated me, asked about my plans, and my grandparents simply beamed. Amid the excitement, I couldn't help but notice the absence of my parents and Adriana. What would they think if they were here to see this? Would they feel proud, betrayed, or perhaps confused as to why this moment had little to do with Adriana's accomplishments? For so long, my parents' entire narrative centered on my sister's upward trajectory. Now, for the first time, it seemed like I was stepping into a spotlight, one that my grandparents had built just for me. After the gathering wound down, I lingered with my grandparents, helping them tidy up the mess of cups and plates. My heart was still racing from the adrenaline of their announcement. Grandpa handed me a small manila folder. Inside were a few documents outlining the specifics, a modest account set up in my name, with instructions on how I could use the funds for educational expenses. "You don't have to figure everything out right away," Grandma reassured me. "We know life can throw surprises, but we wanted you to have this chance, no matter what direction you decide to go." When I finally left that afternoon, the sun was setting in a blaze of reds and oranges. I felt an effervescence in my chest, like the rest of the world had fallen away, and I was floating on a tide of hope. This was more than just financial help. It was a statement, an affirmation that I was worthy of someone's investment, deserving of a future not defined by playing second fiddle to my sister. For the first time in a long while, I felt validated, seen, and ready to take on whatever lay ahead. Driving home, I rehearsed how I would break the news to my parents. But when I walked through the front door, the house was eerily silent. Adriana and my parents must still have been out, presumably celebrating whatever new accolade she'd gathered on their little campus tour. I set my keys on the kitchen counter, the folder of documents still clutched in my hand. In that serene, empty house, I dared to dream that maybe, just maybe, my parents would share in my excitement. But even if they didn't, I had finally glimpsed a future where I no longer begged for their attention or approval. Before heading to bed, I opened the folder one more time, letting my eyes skim over the details. My grandparents' signatures were at the bottom of each page, steady, unwavering, and official. It struck me that I was holding more than paper. I held proof that karma or fate or simple familial love had found a way into my life. My grandparents had chosen me in their own quiet way, and this was just the beginning of a chapter that belonged to me alone. That night, after the gathering at my grandparents' house, I slept more soundly than I had in months. Maybe it was the sense of validation coursing through me, or the knowledge that I no longer had to pinch every penny in the hope of one day attending community college. I awoke with a cautious optimism that perhaps the dynamic at home could finally shift. If my parents saw me with a legitimate chance to forge a real future, maybe they'd at least acknowledge my efforts. Of course, reality had other plans. My parents and Adriana returned early in the morning from their campus visit. I was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and mentally rehearsing how I'd share the news of my grandparents' gift when the front door banged open. My father stomped into the house, his expression tight with frustration. My mother followed, equally tense, and Adriana trailed behind, her eyes downcast as though she'd been forced to witness some unpleasant scene. "What a waste of time," my dad muttered, tossing his keys onto the counter. "They said the scholarship availability was competitive, and they couldn't guarantee anything this late in the process." My mother looked on the verge of tears. Adriana set down her bag without a word, glancing my way, though there was no immediate spark of anger or jealousy in her eyes, just exhaustion. Clearly, their overnight campus trip hadn't gone according to plan, which meant they'd probably pinned all their hopes on a result that simply wasn't guaranteed. After a brief silence, my mother finally seemed to notice me. "Oh, you're up," she said, her tone flat. "Listen, we're going to need to talk about finances. If Adriana doesn't get this scholarship, we'll need to move some funds around to cover her tuition and fees." She slumped against the kitchen table, as if the stress of it all were physically weighing her down. My heart thudded. A week ago, the prospect of telling them about my grandparents' fund might have been daunting. But now, seeing them so worried about money, and noticing how my own ambitions were about to be sidelined again in favor of Adriana's, I felt a simmering courage. "There's something I need to share with you," I said, setting my coffee mug aside. I tried to keep my voice calm, though my pulse thundered in my ears. They both stared at me, as if noticing me for the first time that morning. Adriana kept her distance, near the hallway, arms folded across her chest. I gently laid out what my grandparents had done, how they'd created a small but significant education fund in my name, and how it was meant to help me pursue my own academic goals. With each sentence, my mother's eyes widened a fraction more. My father's face darkened, but I couldn't tell if it was confusion, anger, or something else flickering behind his gaze. When I finished, the kitchen was unnervingly silent. My mother blinked a few times, then cleared her throat. "They set aside money for you," she repeated, as if the idea was almost too foreign to process. I nodded, bracing for her reaction. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly I worried he might crack a tooth. Adriana, on the other hand, turned an odd shade of pink. Finally, my dad let out a laugh, bitter, disbelieving, almost mocking. "And they didn't mention this to us at all," he demanded, voice rising. "Who exactly do they think they are, making decisions like that behind our backs?" I felt heat flare in my cheeks. "They're my grandparents," I shot back, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "They wanted to support my education. It's their money to do with as they please." My mother stood abruptly, knocking her chair sideways. "We're one family," she retorted, her tone laced with indignation. "It's not right for them to single you out without talking to us. You know Adriana needs that money more. She has a shot at a top university, real potential for a prestigious career. Don't you think we should direct resources where they'll have the biggest impact?" Something in her words made my stomach churn. It was as if she was laying out the core belief that governed our household. Adriana's ambitions outranked my own by default. Anger flickered in my chest, but I struggled to keep calm. "I'm not saying Adriana doesn't deserve support," I managed. "But Grandma and Grandpa wanted to help me. They've seen me working nonstop, trying to save for school on my own. Why is that such a problem?" My father's next words felt like a slap. "Because it's selfish," he said, his eyes boring into me. "This family should be pooling its resources for the best possible outcome, Adriana's outcome. Don't you understand that if she succeeds at a top school, it'll benefit all of us in the long run? You can always keep working your little job and attend community college part-time. Why do you need a special fund for that?" My throat tightened. I glanced at Adriana, seeking some hint of solidarity or even guilt, but her gaze was unfocused, pointed somewhere near the floor. She didn't say a word, and that silence was as damning as any insult. Feeling my eyes burn with unshed tears, I drew a shaky breath. "I don't see how supporting me undermines her," I said, hatting the crack in my voice. "Why can't I have a chance to succeed, too?" My mother and father exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Then my mother let out a terse sigh. "Fine. If your grandparents insist on giving you that money, there's nothing we can do. But don't expect us to applaud this. You know we already have enough on our plates with Adriana, and we can't be distracted from what truly matters." What truly matters? The words echoed through my head like a grim refrain. In that moment, it became crystal clear. Nothing I did would shift their lens away from Adriana. They had invested so much of their emotional and financial capital into her future that they couldn't fathom supporting me in any real way. My grandparents had effectively knocked down a barrier by providing the means for me to pursue an education, but the bigger wall, my parents' unyielding favoritism, still loomed high as ever. I left the kitchen before my emotions spilled over. Slipping into my room, I slammed the door behind me, as if shutting out the negativity. My hands trembled and my mind raced. I wasn't naive. I'd expected some pushback. But the sheer dismissal of my dreams cut deeper than I'd anticipated. A part of me wanted to call Grandma and Grandpa right then, to tell them how grateful I was, and also how chaotic things had become because of their generosity. But I hesitated, not wanting to dampen their joy or drag them into a shouting match with my parents. For the rest of that day, I stayed in my room, occasionally flipping through the documents my grandparents had given me, running my fingers over their signatures. Reading their words again, about how they believed in my determination and wanted to encourage my aspirations, was like dipping into a well of strength. No matter what my parents said, I had to remember that I wasn't alone. By evening, the house had regained its usual hum. My parents and Adriana were huddled in the living room, presumably figuring out some last-ditch scholarship plan for her. I found a sort of resigned peace in the solitude of my bedroom. Checking my phone, I saw a text from Grandpa. "Hope you're well. We're very proud of you. Visit soon." My chest squeezed in a combination of gratitude and longing. Their unwavering support felt like a lifeline, a reminder that my life could hold promise beyond my parents' narrow vision. Even so, tension lingered in the days that followed. My parents gave me the cold shoulder, only speaking to me when absolutely necessary. Adriana, caught between a rock and a hard place, seemed torn. On one hand, she was the golden child, reliant on their pride and financial backing. On the other, she might have sensed the injustice of it all but lacked the courage to challenge our parents. At first, I resented her silence, but then I remembered we were just two siblings in a household overshadowed by intense expectations. Even if she was thriving under those expectations, she was still bound by them. Meanwhile, I took proactive steps. I spoke with advisors at a nearby community college, looked into enrollment dates, and started mapping out a realistic timeline to earn my degree. Each small action felt exhilarating, a rebellion against the old pattern of waiting for my parents to acknowledge my potential. I told no one at home about these details, not yet, anyway, preferring to keep my plans close to my chest. But life has a way of testing newly minted resolve. At the bookstore, my manager began hinting that the store might undergo budget cuts, which could impact my hours. My savings weren't substantial enough to cover everything if my hours were slashed, and even with my grandparents' fund, I'd still need a steady income to handle day-to-day expenses. The possibility of losing that financial foothold twisted my stomach in knots. There were nights I lay awake, fear gnawing at me, and wondered if fate was about to yank the rug from under me just as I'd found solid ground. Through it all, my grandparents remained a steady presence. They called every couple of days, careful not to pry, but always reminding me they were there. Their interest in my future was unwavering, so unlike the haphazard, fleeting attention I got at home. With each new day, I felt more certain that somehow, everything was converging on a collision point. Adriana's academic future, my parents' unwavering favoritism, my own slow climb toward independence, and my grandparents' generosity. It all seemed to be propelling us toward some inevitable reckoning. And while that prospect was daunting, I clung to the belief that I was no longer powerless. This time, I had something to hold on to, a tangible path to a life that was truly mine, no matter who in the family tried to stop me. By the time autumn rolled in, the temperature in our home had somehow managed to drop even further than the crisp weather outside. My parents seldom spoke to me beyond the bare necessities. Someone had to pay the bills, take out the trash, maintain the house. If Adriana was in the room, they lavished her with praise, brainstorming more ways to secure her bright future. If I stepped in, an uncomfortable hush usually followed. It was as if we existed in two entirely separate worlds, despite sharing the same roof. Yet, for all their coldness, they still couldn't stop me from moving forward with my plans. True to my word, I kept researching community college classes, comparing schedules, and calculating tuition costs. It was a delicate dance. I needed to align my potential class schedule with the shifts at the bookstore so I wouldn't lose my primary source of income. My grandparents' education fund was a blessing, but it wasn't infinite. I still needed to contribute to everyday expenses. Late at night, I'd spread out pages of scribbled notes on my bed, mapping out hypothetical scenarios. If I take this class on Tuesdays, Thursdays, then I can work Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays. It was like solving a complex puzzle, but I found a strange satisfaction in the process. One particularly chilly evening, Grandpa called me just to chat. We talked for nearly an hour, long enough that I had to pace in the backyard to keep warm. He told me how proud he was of my determination, how he was confident I'd find a way to juggle school and work. When I hesitated, confessing my fears about balancing everything, he said something that stayed with me long after I hung up the phone. Sometimes, life doesn't wait for perfect conditions. You do what you can with what you have, and that's more than enough. Bolstered by his words, I decided to take the leap. I scoured the community college website, found an evening class in my field of interest, marketing, a subject I'd always been curious about but never had the chance to explore, and emailed an advisor for guidance. It felt exhilarating to press that send button, knowing I was one step closer to forging a path of my own. I half expected to feel guilty, given how staunchly my parents believed every resource should flow to Adriana, but the guilt never came. Instead, a swell of excitement replaced it, like I was finally waking up after years of living in someone else's shadow. The next morning, though, my renewed optimism took a hit. At the bookstore, my manager called me into his cramped office, barely large enough for 2 chairs, and broke the news. Corporate was cutting our budget. My hours would be slashed significantly, effective the following week. I felt my stomach drop as he tried to console me, explaining that he was fighting to keep me on staff at all. But the numbers were ruthless, and he couldn't guarantee more than 15 or 20 hours a week moving forward. I left that office feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. The timing couldn't have been worse. With fewer hours, I'd have to stretch every dollar more than ever. Sure, my grandparents' fund would cover much of my tuition, but I still had textbooks and other expenses. And of course, I needed money for things like car insurance, phone bills, and eventually moving out of my parents' house. On the drive home, I tried to stay calm, reminding myself of Grandpa's advice. We do what we can with what we have. But what if what I have is no longer enough? I wondered. That evening, I planned to talk it through with my grandparents, maybe brainstorm ways to supplement my income. But fate intervened yet again, this time in the form of Adriana. I found her sitting on my bed when I got home, hugging a pillow and staring at the wall with a vacant expression. It was such a stark contrast to her usual confident, center-of-attention demeanor that I nearly dropped my phone in surprise. "What are you doing here?" I asked softly, trying not to sound accusatory. We hadn't exactly been on great terms lately, but worry flickered in my chest at the sight of her. She looked small, vulnerable even. Her eyes darted up to meet mine. "They didn't even knock," she mumbled, obviously referring to our parents. "They just barged in and started ranting about deadlines and finances, telling me it's my responsibility to find more scholarships if I want to go to an elite university. Mom was talking about taking out loans. Dad was furious that I hadn't secured more grants. It's like everything's my fault suddenly." A part of me wanted to bristle. This was the sister who'd basked in their adoration for so long. But another part recognized the toll it took to be so heavily depended upon. I sighed, dropping my bag and sitting beside her. "That sounds rough," I said, keeping my voice low. "But you know they mean well. They just—" "Do they?" Adriana interjected, eyes flashing. "Because lately it feels like they only care about me as an investment, like I'm not even a person, just a potential trophy student who can validate all the sacrifices they've made." She tugged at the pillow, her knuckles turning white. "I can't breathe, you know. Everything is about my grades, my extracurriculars, my interviews. They've never asked what I actually want." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. My emotions tangled into a knot. Part of me sympathized, truly I did. But I also couldn't forget how her success had always come at my expense, how our parents had dismissed me for years in favor of her achievements. Still, I forced myself to respond gently. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I know it must be a lot of pressure. I hesitated, debating whether to reveal my own struggles. "I've always felt overshadowed. But I can see how it might be stifling to be front and center like that." For the briefest moment, our eyes locked in a mutual understanding that had been missing for years. She exhaled shakily. "Yeah, I guess we both got the short end of the stick, huh?" Then, with a wry laugh, she added, "But at least you have Grandma and Grandpa. Mom and Dad are furious about that whole fund thing, by the way." I cringed. "I know. They basically told me I was selfish for accepting it." I paused, remembering my manager's news. "And now my hours at the bookstore are cut. I'm trying to figure out how to afford everything if I start classes soon." She nodded, looking genuinely concerned. "That's tough." We lapsed into a silence loaded with all the things we'd never said to each other. How lonely I'd felt in her shadow, how burdened she felt by our parents' expectations. It wasn't exactly a heartwarming sisterly reunion, but it was a fragile moment of truce in a long-standing war neither of us had consciously declared. Eventually, Adriana stood up, smoothing out the duvet. Her earlier vulnerability had receded just a bit, replaced by her customary resolve. "Look," she said, "I appreciate you listening. Seriously. And I know you're under a lot of pressure, too. Maybe we can," she trailed off, her eyes darting to the door as though worried our parents might overhear. "I'm not saying we'll ever be best friends or anything, but maybe we can stop seeing each other as enemies." My chest tightened. It was a surprisingly honest admission, and I found myself nodding. "I'd like that," I replied, my voice quiet. Despite all the frustration and envy, we were siblings. We'd both been caught in the orbit of our parents' impossible expectations for so long, maybe we'd lost sight of each other as people. After Adriana left the room, I sat on my bed, replaying the conversation in my mind. It was like a tiny crack in the fortress that had separated us for so long. Whether it would widen into genuine empathy or slam shut again under parental pressure remained to be seen. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of something that resembled sisterly compassion. That night, I called my grandparents and told them about my reduced hours at work, my upcoming class, and the strange, tentative bond Adriana and I had just forged. My grandma listened patiently, offering practical suggestions. Maybe I could pick up a small freelance gig or tutor younger kids to earn extra money. My grandpa reinforced how proud he was, urging me to keep going. Their unwavering belief in me was a balm to every wound inflicted by my parents' disinterest. By the time I went to bed, I felt drained but also strangely hopeful. Yes, my hours at the bookstore had been cut, and my parents' approval was still nowhere in sight. But I had a class lined up, a partial plan for making ends meet, and even the faintest sense that Adriana might, in her own way, understand some part of my struggle. Perhaps the tides were beginning to turn, albeit slowly and in ways I hadn't anticipated. Karma, or fate, or simply life, was shifting the pieces around on the board, and for once, I felt like I might actually have a chance to play a meaningful role in the next move. The next few weeks felt like walking a tightrope in my own home. My relationship with Adriana took on a cautious civility, a fragile ceasefire where we tiptoed around each other's vulnerabilities. Every once in a while, we shared a small moment, a comment about school stress or a sarcastic joke about our parents' latest demand, but we never delved too deeply. It was as though we both feared that any wrong word could send us spiraling back into the old resentments. Meanwhile, my parents continued to treat me like I was invisible, except when they felt the need to chastise me for something trivial, an unwashed dish in the sink, a missed grocery item, or, worst of all, the fact that I was wasting Grandma and Grandpa's money by enrolling in a class at community college. Despite their protests, I began that marketing course, attending evening lectures after my shortened shifts at the bookstore. The first night I walked into the lecture hall, nerves tangled in my stomach, I felt a surge of excitement I hadn't known in years. Sitting among other students, adults juggling jobs, young people fresh out of high school, I realized I wasn't alone in forging a new path. Everyone there had their own story, their own reason for being in that room. Almost immediately, I fell in love with the subject matter. The professor was engaging, weaving real-world examples into every concept. I found myself poring over the textbook long after class ended, scribbling notes in the margins, dreaming up potential marketing campaigns I might create one day. Each new concept lit up a piece of my brain that had lain dormant under years of overshadowed existence. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving, discovering something I could truly excel at. But as life tends to do, it balanced that new spark of joy with fresh challenges. My bookstore hours continued to shrink. Some weeks, I barely reached 15 hours, and my paychecks, predictably, were depressingly small. I started browsing online job boards in the dead of night, sending out applications for part-time or freelance gigs, anything to patch the gap. A sense of urgency nipped at my heels. Even if my grandparents' fund covered my tuition, I still needed to pay for gas, groceries, and basic living expenses. And given that my parents showed zero willingness to offer any additional help, the pressure was on me, and me alone. One evening, after a particularly draining shift, I arrived home to find Adriana packing the living room in agitation. My parents were perched on the sofa, arms crossed, wearing identical expressions of disapproval. The air practically crackled with tension. I froze in the doorway, grocery bags in hand, unsure if I should slip away unnoticed or walk into the storm. Adriana spotted me first. "Tell them," she said, her voice tight, gesturing in my direction. My mother's gaze flicked toward me, but she said nothing. My father simply shook his head, as if I were an outsider intruding on family matters. I set the bags on the floor, heart thudding. "Tell them what?" I asked. Adriana swallowed hard, then turned to our parents. "She's been doing college classes," she said bluntly, "and somehow juggling work, too. Meanwhile, you both act like she's just mooching off Grandma and Grandpa's generosity. It's not fair." My breath caught. My sister, a person who had always stood under the spotlight of my parents' favor, was defending me. I looked at her in surprise, and she shrugged, a flicker of defiance lighting her eyes. "I'm not saying you shouldn't still focus on me and all that," she added, as if to appease them. "But this whole silent treatment toward her is messed up." My father set his jaw, clearly unimpressed. My mother broke the tense silence first, addressing Adriana, not me. "We've been sacrificing for you for years," she said, her tone tinged with anger. "Your sister is an adult. She can do whatever she wants, but we're not about to pretend that her path is more important than yours. We're stretched thin, financially, emotionally, and she's off playing student with handouts from your grandparents." That barb stung. I wanted to shout that I was working just as hard as any of them, that the money from Grandma and Grandpa was a lifeline, not a luxury. But Adriana spoke up again, an uncharacteristic edge in her voice. "You can't keep blaming her for existing," she said. "If you want to be mad at Grandma and Grandpa for giving her money, then be mad at them. But this is ridiculous." My father stood, looming over Adriana in a way that made me tense. "Watch your tone," he warned, voice dangerously low. "We are not the bad guys here. We've invested everything in you, Adriana, everything. Don't turn around and shame us now because your sister decided to go behind our backs." Emotions churned in my chest, anger, hurt, and a faint sense of vindication that at least Adriana saw how lopsided this all was. But I also felt a pinch of sympathy for her. She was caught in the crossfire of our parents' expectations and her own budding awareness that those expectations might be unfair. Unable to bear the tension any longer, I mustered the courage to speak. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said quietly, my voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "I'm just trying to build a life for myself, one that doesn't revolve around being overshadowed. Grandma and Grandpa helped me, yes, but that's because they believe in me. That doesn't take away from Adriana's accomplishments or the support you want to give her." My mother's lips thinned into a line. "We can't have both. Resources are limited, and it's better to invest in someone who's guaranteed to shine. You might like this marketing class or whatever, but that doesn't mean you'll go anywhere with it." Her words cut like a knife, the casual dismissal far more painful than any screaming match could have been. At that, Adriana winced, as if she too realized how cruel that sounded. She shot me an apologetic look, but I just swallowed, nodding to myself. "Well," I managed, voice trembling, "thanks for being honest, at least." My parents' faces remained impassive. Without another word, I gathered the grocery bags and walked away, leaving Adriana to deal with the fallout of her brief stand in my defense. Once I was safely behind the closed door of my room, I allowed tears of frustration and anger to spill over. My mother's words replayed in my head. "You might like this marketing class, but that doesn't mean you'll go anywhere with it." It felt so final, so emblematic of their whole view of me, as if I were a perpetual disappointment, not worth the effort of encouragement. Despite my grandparents' faith in me, despite my newfound passion for my studies, my parents refused to see any value in what I was doing. In the days that followed, Adriana retreated into herself, possibly regretting her outburst. She seemed torn between wanting to break free from the pressure and remaining the star child our parents demanded she be. I too withdrew, focusing on my coursework, applying for side gigs, and hunting for ways to stretch my limited income. At class, I dove into every project, every discussion, determined to prove, to myself if no one else, that I was capable. If my parents refused to believe in me, I'd just have to believe in myself harder. Then, a glimmer of hope arrived in the form of a small freelance marketing job. An online artisan bakery needed someone to manage their social media campaigns on a part-time basis, and a friend of a friend recommended me. I spent a weekend locked in my room, polishing up a sample portfolio, mock Instagram posts, potential slogans, a detailed marketing outline. When they emailed back with an offer, I nearly jumped for joy. It wasn't much, just a few hours of work a week, but it paid better per hour than the bookstore. More importantly, it gave me real-world experience in the very field I was studying. The night I got the news, I told only my grandparents. I texted Grandpa a screenshot of the email, and he replied with so many exclamation points that my phone almost froze. Grandma left me a heartfelt voicemail saying how proud she was of me, how they knew I could do this. Their love buoyed me in a house where supportive words were scarce. Despite the mounting tension at home, I felt a shift within myself, a sense of resilience taking root. Every day, I balanced my diminishing bookstore shifts, my marketing coursework, and the new freelance gig, inching closer to a reality that belonged to me and no one else. My parents might have seen it as a doomed endeavor, but I saw the faint glow of a future I'd carved from nothing but determination and a little help from my grandparents. With each step I took, I sensed the cracks growing in the foundation of our family's lopsided dynamic. Adriana was restless. My parents were pushing themselves into an ever-tighter corner of stubbornness, and my grandparents were quietly orchestrating opportunities for me behind the scenes. It felt like we were all hurtling toward an inevitable tipping point, an event that would either break our family apart or allow us to rebuild on new ground. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the passive, overshadowed daughter anymore, and that realization was the most powerful thing of all. The turning point arrived one cold winter afternoon, as unexpected as a sudden gust of wind. I just come home from another grueling day, a shortened shift at the bookstore followed by a quick stop at my favorite cafe to work on a social media proposal for my artisan bakery clients. My cheeks were tinged red from the chilly air outside, and my brain was swirling with half-formed ideas for marketing campaigns. In other words, it was a fairly typical day in my new normal, busy, stressful, and oddly fulfilling. The last thing I expected to see when I pushed open the front door was my entire family, my parents, Adriana, and my grandparents, all seated in the living room. My mother and father were on one side, my grandparents on the other, and Adriana stood awkwardly between them. Tension hung in the air like static electricity, sharp enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Instantly, my heart lurched, warning me that something seismic was about to happen. Grandma was the first to break the silence. "There you are," she said softly, her eyes brimming with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Grandpa offered me a small nod, though his jaw was set in an unusually firm line. I glanced at Adriana, who looked as though she wanted to evaporate on the spot. My parents, on the other hand, wore expressions that teetered between anger and defiance. Cautiously, I stepped forward, shrugging off my coat and dropping my bag near the doorway. "What's going on?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. A pin could have dropped, and it would have sounded like a thunderclap. My father cleared his throat. We were all just talking." The words came out strained, as if forced through clenched teeth. "Your grandparents had some opinions about how we've been managing certain family matters." He gestured vaguely, as though reluctant to even say my name. Grandma inhaled, her gaze shifting between me and my parents. "We've known for a while that something has to change," she said, choosing each word carefully. "The way you've been treating your daughter," her eyes flicked to me, "isn't fair, and it's causing damage that might be irreparable if it keeps going this way." I felt an immediate flush creep up my neck. While I was touched my grandparents were standing up for me, it also felt unnerving to have all the family conflict laid bare in our living room. My mother bristled, crossing her arms. "We're doing the best we can," she snapped. "We have limited resources. Adriana's future is paramount, and if that means we have to prioritize her over." "Over me," I finished for her, the bitterness in my own voice surprising me. "It's okay, Mom. You can say it out loud. It's not exactly a secret." My father scowled, but Grandpa spoke before Dad could. "We're not here to tear anyone down," Grandpa said, voice steady but firm. "We just want you to acknowledge that you've overlooked your other daughter's aspirations for far too long, and now that she's making strides, you still belittle her instead of showing support." My parents exchanged agitated glances, and for a moment I half expected one of them to storm out. My mother let out a frustrated noise, turning to address my grandparents directly. "Look, we appreciate everything you've done for the family," she began, her tone tight. "But this meddling is not fair. We've sacrificed so much for Adriana's education, her opportunities. We can't just shift focus out of nowhere." My mother, jabbed a finger in my direction, isn't even sure what she wants to do in life. A few marketing classes and a side gig don't guarantee a future. Heat rose to my face, equal parts anger and shame. But before I could respond, Adriana stepped forward. Her posture was tense, eyes flashing. "Mom, Dad," she said, swallowing hard. "I told you before I appreciate your faith in me, but you've put everything on my shoulders. It's suffocating. And you've ignored my sister for years. You can't claim that's acceptable just because you think my success will pay off more." She turned toward me then, and I saw genuine conflict there. "You were right. It isn't fair, not to her and not even to me." An uneasy silence followed, my parents clearly at a loss for how to respond to Adriana's uncharacteristic defiance. Grandma used the pause to step in. "We've offered our support to both of our grandchildren," she said gently. "We've encouraged them to find their own paths. Now, if you too," she nodded at my parents, "truly believe you're doing your best, then ask yourselves, why does everyone in this family seem miserable, one way or another?" It was a pointed question, and it hung in the air with all the weight it deserved. My father's shoulders sagged, just a fraction. My mother blinked rapidly, as though warding off tears or resentment or both. At last, Dad cleared his throat again. "So what do you want us to do?" he asked, subdued. We can't magically conjure more money or resources, and frankly, we don't think you should have gone behind our backs to set up that fund for," he trailed off, leaving my name implied but unsaid. Grandpa's expression hardened. "We used our own resources to help your daughter because we saw she was being neglected," he said bluntly. "If you resent us for that, so be it. But do you resent her for taking it, too?" That question sliced through the room, landing squarely on my parents. I watched them wrestle internally with how to answer. My mother's gaze darted to me, then back to the floor. I remembered all the times she told me I was selfish for accepting the help, that I should have remained in the background for my sister's sake. My father, stony-faced, finally forced out a response. "We don't resent her," he said, the words sounding like they'd been dragged from his throat. We had a plan for Adriana's future, and we didn't realize how left out." He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. Surprise washed over me. That was the closest either of them had come to admitting any wrongdoing. I didn't know if I should feel relief or continue bracing for a fight. So I stood there, hands clasped tightly, letting the gravity of the moment settle in. Grandma softened her tone. "Well, you realize it now," she said, "and you have two choices. Keep doubling down on an approach that's hurting both your daughters or start trying to support them each in their own way. It's that simple." For a moment, no one spoke, the quiet hum of the heater filling the silence. Then, in a move that startled even me, Adriana moved to my side and looped an arm through mine. "She deserves a shot, too," she said quietly. "I'm not the only one in this house who can make you proud." My parents looked at us, two grown children who, despite our conflicts, stood shoulder to shoulder in that moment. A faint tremor passed across my mother's expression, maybe guilt or regret, but she didn't voice it. My father just nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Grandpa cleared his throat, looking around the room. "We're not asking for miracles," he said. "We just want to see this family respect each other, truly respect each other. Every person here has value. If you can't understand that, then we'll keep doing what we must to make sure our grandchildren aren't held back by favoritism or resentment." He could have thundered that statement, but instead, it came out measured and unassailable, like a simple fact, as immutable as the sunrise. My parents offered no immediate argument. My father ran a hand through his hair, my mother's eyes glistened, and neither of them seemed to know what to do next. In a sense, that might have been enough for them to be confronted with the stark truth of how their choices had shaped our household. After a few awkward goodbyes, Grandma and Grandpa made their exit, leaving behind the lingering possibility that maybe we weren't entirely broken. My parents disappeared into their bedrooms soon after, not addressing us again that night. Adriana and I were left in the living room, the tension slowly seeping out of the walls. "That was intense," she said, finally letting go of my arm. I nodded, too emotionally drained to give more than a small acknowledgement. Neither of us had the energy to dissect what had just happened. We parted ways, she to her room, and I to mine, uncertain whether this confrontation would truly lead to a shift or just simmer beneath the surface until the next eruption. But something felt different when I closed my bedroom door. The old dread, the sense of being trapped in a hierarchy that placed me dead last, didn't weigh on me quite as heavily. My grandparents had stood up for me in a way I never dared to hope. And for once, Adriana had sided with me, too, admitting she was suffocating under our parents' expectations. In the days that followed, the changes were subtle but real. My parents didn't transform overnight. There were no heartfelt apologies or dramatic reconciliations, but they seemed warier of voicing their dismissal of my efforts. When I told them I'd landed a second small freelance project, they didn't call it useless or a waste of time. My mother offered a reserved nod. My father mumbled something about, "At least you're earning money." It wasn't acceptance, exactly, but it was less outright contempt. A small crack in the wall they'd built around my sister, perhaps. Adriana, too, seemed lighter. She still shouldered massive pressure from my parents, but every so often, she'd knock on my door to chat. Sometimes, we actually laughed, trading stories about our days, marveling at how dysfunctional our family dynamic had been for so long. We weren't best friends, but we were no longer strangers or rivals. We were two individuals navigating a complicated household, gradually realizing we might both thrive if we stopped competing for a spotlight. And as for my grandparents, They remained the bedrock of support I'd always craved, but never thought I deserved. Grandma called almost daily, checking on my coursework and my mental well-being. Grandpa emailed me marketing tips he'd found on the internet. Most were outdated or simplistic, but I treasured the gesture. No matter how small, it reminded me that I had advocates who saw me not as a second-string player, but as someone with the potential to build a fulfilling life. Looking back on that confrontation, it's clear it wasn't a fairy tale ending or a one-time fix. It was more like the day the family portrait got rearranged, allowing space for me in the frame. My parents might never fully grasp how their choices hurt me, and I might never completely shake the scars of feeling overlooked. But I saw a path forward, one paved with my own emerging career, my blossoming relationship with Adriana, and my grandparents' unwavering faith in me. For the first time, I felt a surge of pride in telling people about my studies, my freelance work, and the sense of accomplishment that came from walking into that community college every week. I was just someone's sister anymore, or a child overshadowed by the golden sibling. I was me, learning, growing, earning my own stripes, and that was enough. In the end, I guess you could say karma did come in the form of my grandparents. Or maybe it was simply their love, asserting itself in a family where priorities had run amok. Either way, it led me to a place I'd rarely visited, the center of my own story, standing on equal ground with a sibling once elevated above me. And while life would never be perfect, it finally felt like I had more than a fighting chance to shine in my own right. It felt like I had a family portrait where I was no longer cropped out, or at least, where I was free to step forward without being shoved aside. And for me, that was a picture worth striving for.